The room had been loud all morning. Chairs scraping, paddles snapping up, people coughing in a coffee breath, and fake patience. Then, Lot 47 came in, a smoke-darkened painting in a cracked gold frame. The kind of thing most people would hang in a hallway and forget. The auctioneer glanced at the card. Unsigned river landscape. Estate fresh. Some damage. We'll open at 400. A few lazy hands went up. 400. 6. 8. 1,000. Normal. Boring. Then from the third row, a man in a faded brown jacket lifted his paddle and said, very calmly, 19,000. Not 1,900. 19,000. And just like that, the room went silent. Even the auctioneer stopped. You could hear the old vent rattling above the chandeliers. A woman near the aisle actually turned all the way around in her chair, because the man who just said it did not look like someone who had $19,000 to throw at a damaged painting. He looked like he'd come to fix the boiler. And the strange part? He didn't look nervous anymore. He looked certain. That's when everyone in the room had the same thought at the same time. What did he see? Because nobody jumps from 12,000 to 19 by accident. Nobody says a number like that unless they know something. And Ben Holloway knew something. He just wasn't ready to say what. Ben was 58, thin in the shoulders, quiet in the way some men get after life has taken enough swings at them. He wore the same square-faced Timex watch every day. The plastic had gone cloudy years ago, but it still worked. He kept peppermints in his jacket pocket because he'd quit smoking 8 winters earlier and never quite got over wanting something in his mouth when he was stressed. And when he got stressed, which was often, he rolled the mint between his fingers before unwrapping it. That morning, he'd already gone through 3. He wasn't a collector, wasn't a dealer, wasn't one of those people who said things like provenance and patina like they were born with a silver spoon and a tax attorney. Ben worked nights, maintenance at the Red Bank Museum of American History. Not curator, not conservator, not expert. He fixed lights, patched drywall, moved crates when the exhibits changed, swept up after fundraisers full of people who never looked directly at him. And every Saturday, if he wasn't picking up an extra shift, he went to estate sales and county auctions, mostly for small furniture, old tools, sometimes clocks. He'd clean them up in his garage, tighten what was loose, sand what was rough, and sell them for a little more than he paid. Nothing glamorous, just enough to help with bills. That was Ben, careful with money, careful with words. The kind of man who folded grocery receipts before he put them in his wallet. So when a room full of antique dealers heard that man say $19,000 for a dirty, damaged painting, it didn't just sound strange. It sounded impossible. And impossible things make people mean. A man in a navy blazer leaned toward his friend and whispered too loudly, either he's drunk or this is about to get real funny. A few people laughed. Not a big laugh, just enough. The kind that lands on the back of your neck. Ben heard it. Of course he heard it. He kept his eyes on the painting. The auctioneer cleared his throat. Sir, I have 19,000. Ben nodded once. The auction clerk looked over from the side table. She knew him from check-in. At 8 that morning, when he'd come to register, she'd asked him twice if he wanted a spectator badge instead. Not mean exactly, just automatic, like she'd already decided where he belonged. He had handed over his deposit without saying a word. That had changed her tone, but only a little. Now she was staring at him again, trying to figure him out, trying to figure out whether this was courage, stupidity, or something else. Across the aisle sat Nolan Pierce. Everyone there knew Nolan. Expensive loafers, polished smile, local dealer with a gallery 2 towns over, and the kind of voice that always sounded half amused, half offended. He had been bidding on the painting from the start, slowly, confidently, like he owned the room and was just deciding how much fun he wanted to have before taking the thing home. Nolan turned his head and looked at Ben for the first time. Really looked at him, not with contempt. Worse, with interest. That was when Ben understood something simple and dangerous. Nolan had seen it too, or at least enough of it, enough to keep going. And that changed everything. Because up until 10 minutes earlier, Ben had told himself he would stop at 7,000. That had been the plan. A hard ceiling. He had repeated it to himself in the parking lot. 7. Not $1 more. He had even written the number on the back of an envelope and tucked it into his inside pocket like it might help him behave. But plans are easy before the bidding starts, before your pulse gets involved, before another man in a silk tie keeps lifting his paddle like he's not buying an object but trying to erase you from the room. The painting had come from the Whitmore estate. Old house on Bell Street. 3 floors. Boarded windows. Kitchen fire 2 years earlier. The owner, Charles Whitmore, had died in assisted living last fall with no children, no wife, and a basement full of things nobody had inventoried properly in decades. The auction listing online had been terrible. Blurry photos. Bad lighting. One-sentence descriptions. Most people were there for the furniture, the silver, and a grandfather clock in the entry hall. Ben had come because of one photo. Not the front of the painting. The back. A crooked image taken in low light. Brown paper backing torn at one corner. A stretcher bar visible through the rip. Most people would have scrolled right past it. Ben didn't. He stared at that picture for almost 20 minutes the night before. Then another 10. Then he enlarged it until the whole image turned to grain. Because there was something there. Not obvious. Not dramatic. Just a shape. A fragment of a label. And on that label, barely visible under the glare, one printed letter. 8B. It should have meant nothing. But it didn't. Because 23 years earlier, before his hair went gray, and before his wife got sick, and before money became a thing you thought about every single day, Ben had helped clear a flooded storage room at the museum. Boxes were stacked everywhere. Wet ledgers, framed prints, old catalogs. And while the curators panicked, Ben and another maintenance guy carried whatever they were told to carry. At one point, one of the registrars handed Ben a damaged exhibition binder and said, "Don't lose this. It's the only copy left." He didn't lose it. He took it upstairs, sat on an overturned crate while waiting for the elevator. And because he was bored, he opened it. Inside was a black and white catalog from a 1974 regional exhibition. Missouri River Painters. Forgotten names. One page and a note clipped to it. Loan request denied. Work missing since 1981 estate transfer. The painting in the photo was grainy. Dark. A river bend. 3 fence posts. A leaning cottonwood near the waterline. Title, Evening Crossing. Artist, Clara Beaumont. Ben remembered that page for one stupid reason. On the lower right side of the image, the canvas had a thin diagonal scar, like someone had nicked it with a blade years earlier and repaired it badly. The registrar had complained out loud while flipping pages. Every time something goes missing, it's always the modest ones, never the masterpieces, always the ones nobody protects. That line stayed with him, maybe because it sounded true about more than paintings. A week later, he forgot the artist's name, then remembered it again. Then years passed. Life got crowded, but some details never really leave. A crooked fence post, a repaired slash, a letter B on an old backing label. That's what dragged him to the auction. Not certainty, not greed, just a feeling, a small, stubborn feeling. And if you've ever been poor for long enough, you know feelings are dangerous. Because hope is expensive. Ben had told nobody. Not his daughter, Rachel. Not his friend Earl from the museum. Not even himself in a full sentence. He just drove to the auction house before opening, parked near the loading dock, and sat in the truck with the heat off to save a little gas. Then he went inside. He walked the preview room once. Didn't touch the painting at first. Circled. Pretended to study a side table. Waited until 2 dealers moved on to a bronze lamp. Then he stepped up. The painting was smaller than he expected. Maybe 24 by 30. The frame was chipped at 2 corners. The varnish had yellowed so badly the sky looked brown. At first glance, it really did look like nothing. He leaned slightly, not enough to draw attention. There it was, lower right, a faint raised line under the varnish. Old repair, diagonal. He felt his throat tighten. Then he looked at the back. The brown paper had been replaced at some point, but not well. At the torn corner, another layer showed through. Old linen tape. And beneath that, the edge of a gallery label. Not complete. Just enough. EUM. He stepped back. Didn't breathe. Not for a second. Because now was no longer a maybe. Now was one of 2 things. Either a ruined copy that happened to line up in all the wrong ways, or a lost painting that had somehow spent 40 years passing through attics, basements, and blind inheritances until it landed here, under fluorescent lights, next to a broken buffet table. That was when Nolan appeared beside him. "Ugly thing," Nolan said. Ben said nothing. Nolan bent, squinted at the frame, and smiled a little. "Frame's decent, though." Still Ben said nothing. Nolan straightened. "You buying frames today?" Ben looked at him. "Maybe." Nolan gave a tiny shrug. That was it. Short conversation. Nothing dramatic. But from that point on, Ben could feel him around the room. Never close enough to accuse. Never far enough to forget. By the time the painting came up for auction, Ben knew the worst part. He wasn't the only one who had noticed. And when two people suspect the same hidden thing, the price stops being about value. It becomes a test. The bidding opened at 400. A woman near the front went to 6. Then a man in suspenders said 8. Nolan took it to 1,000 without even raising his chin. Ben waited. At 1,500, the woman dropped out. At 2,000, the man in suspenders gave up. Now it was mostly dealers. 3,000, 3,500, 4,000. Ben got in at 45. Didn't mean to. His paddle was up before he'd fully decided. The auctioneer pointed. 45, thank you. Nolan answered at 5. Ben, at 55. Nolan at 6. The back of Ben's neck felt hot. The room changed shape around him. What had been casual became focused. People who hadn't cared 2 minutes earlier were suddenly paying attention. Because experienced rooms can smell hidden value. And if two people are fighting over an ugly thing, everyone assumes the ugly thing isn't ugly after all. 7,000. That was the ceiling. That was supposed to be the end. Nolan said 65. Ben said 7. There. Done. Finished. He could stop now and still feel sane. The auctioneer nodded toward Nolan. 65 is with you. Now 7. Looking for 75. Nolan lifted one finger. 75. Ben stared at the painting. His mint had gone sharp and bitter in his mouth. He could hear his wife, June, in that old practical voice she used when bills stacked up on the counter. Don't fall in love with a maybe. That had been her rule. At estate sales. At pawn shops. At every flea market where people convinced themselves junk was treasure. Don't fall in love with a maybe. The smart thing would have been to let it go. But then something happened. Small. So small most people missed it. The porter at the side of the stage shifted the painting to keep it from tipping. Just an inch. Maybe less. And for half a second, under the frame lip near the lower edge, Ben saw a fleck of blue. Not brown. Not muddy gray. Blue. Deep, mineral blue. The kind old painters used before cheaper pigments made everything flatter. It was there and gone. But it was enough. Because cheap copies imitate the image. They don't hide quality under damage. Ben lifted his paddle. 8. The room made that soft auction sound. Not applause. Not speech. Just collective reaction. Nolan didn't hesitate. 9. Ben swallowed. This was already stupid. At 10,000, the room stopped pretending not to watch. At 11, even the people waiting for silver service trays leaned in. At 12, the auctioneer's voice sharpened. Because now this lot mattered. Now his commission mattered. Now the story mattered. The clerk moved closer to the podium. Ben could feel people studying his jacket, his boots, his hands. Trying to place him. Trying to decide whether he was some hidden millionaire in disguise or just a fool with bad impulse control. He was neither. He was a tired man with a mortgage, a daughter still paying off nursing school, and exactly one reason for staying in the fight. He believed the painting was real. Not because he wanted it to be, because too many details were wrong in the right direction. That was the difference. Anyone can fake one clue. Maybe 2, but not all of them. Not the label fragment. Not the old repair scar. Not the quality under the varnish. Not the composition he remembered from a water-stained catalog 23 years ago. Nolan went at 13. Ben answered at 13.5. Nolan at 14. Ben looked down at the envelope in his pocket, as if numbers could change if you avoided eye contact. This was past reckless now. This was the point where sensible people sat down and let money leave the room without them. His thumb rubbed the fold of the envelope until it went soft. He could stop. He should stop. Then Nolan did something that made the decision for him. He laughed. Not loud. Not for the room. Just for Ben. A quick little breath through the nose. And then he said, without looking over, Come on, buddy. Don't get hurt. That word. Buddy. Not sir. Not friend. Buddy. Soft disrespect. Assumed weakness. Ben felt something inside him go still. And it wasn't pride. It was clarity. Because men like Nolan had spent their whole lives reading rooms, reading clothes, reading hesitation. They bet on other people flinching. They counted on it. Ben lifted his paddle. 15. Nolan came back at 16. The auctioneer was moving faster now. 16, now 17. Will you give me 17? Ben didn't move. His heart hammered so hard he could feel it in his jaw. 17 was not just a number. 17 was the used pickup transmission he still hadn't fixed. 17 was 8 months of groceries if he got careful. 17 was the difference between manageable trouble and real trouble. The auctioneer looked at him. So did Nolan. So did the room. And in that strange little silence, Ben remembered another day. Another room. Not an auction house. A hospital office. June sitting beside him, thinner than she should have been, hands folded, listening to a woman explain treatment options in a voice so polished it barely sounded human. Ben had asked what the next round would cost. The woman told him. He laughed. Not because it was funny, because sometimes numbers stop sounding real when they get cruel enough. That night, June told him something he never forgot. Money only acts important because people are afraid of it. Then she smiled, tired, but still herself. And fear makes people predictable. Ben hadn't understood how much that sentence would follow him. Until now, because Nolan expected fear to do the work for him. Expected Ben to fold. Expected the room to keep agreeing with what it saw on the outside. Ben raised his paddle. 17. A few heads turned again. Nolan answered at 18 almost before the auctioneer finished speaking. Too fast. Too clean. Like he wanted to end it right there. Like he assumed no sane man would cross that line for a dirty regional painting with no visible signature. The auctioneer looked back to Ben. 18,000. Looking for 18.5. Ben didn't move. Not immediately. He looked at the painting. At the ruined varnish. At the scar in the canvas. At the cheap lot tag hanging from the frame. Then he looked at Nolan. Perfect tie knot. Perfect watch. Perfect calm. Only now it wasn't calm. Now it was something tighter. Something watchful. And that was the final clue. Not on the painting. On Nolan. Because if the painting was worthless, Nolan would have let it go. A dealer protects margin. A gambler protects ego. But a man who keeps bidding on damaged work in front of a room like this, he's protecting information. The auctioneer leaned forward. 18,000. Fair warning. Ben took the peppermint out of his mouth, set it in his palm. Then he lifted his paddle and said, very clearly, 19,000. Silence. Real silence. Heavy enough to feel. The auctioneer blinked. The clerk looked up sharply. Someone in the back whispered, Jesus. Nolan didn't move. That was the strange part. He didn't scoff. Didn't smile. Didn't bid back. He just stared at Ben for one long second. And in that second, the room understood everything it needed to understand. The maintenance man hadn't made a mistake. He'd drawn a line. And he'd drawn it where he knew the other man would stop. The auctioneer found his voice again. I have 19,000. Looking for 19.5. Nothing. 19,000. Fair warning. No movement. Last call. Nolan looked at the painting once more. Then leaned back. Small motion. Barely anything. But it was surrender. Sold, the auctioneer said, bringing the hammer down, for $19,000. And the room exhaled all at once. Not because the sale was big. Rooms like that had seen bigger. Because of who made it. Because power had just moved from one side of the aisle to the other, and everybody had felt it happen. Ben didn't smile. Didn't celebrate. Didn't turn around to enjoy the shock on anyone's face. He just nodded once and sat down like a man who still had to survive the consequences of what he'd done. Which he did. He paid. That was the first unpleasant surprise for the room. No bounce card. No awkward delay. No embarrassed explanation. He paid the deposit, signed the invoice, and arranged pickup for the next morning. His hands shook a little while he wrote. Only a little. Outside, the air had gone colder. The parking lot smelled like wet leaves and diesel. Ben stood by his truck with the receipt in his hand, looking at the total with premium added. Over 21,000. Seeing on paper made him feel slightly sick. That's when Nolan walked over. No gallery smile now. No audience. Just the two of them under a gray sky. I'll make this easy, Nolan said. 28,000 right now. Ben looked up. Nolan slid his phone from his coat pocket. I wired today. You don't even have to load the thing. Ben folded the receipt once. Carefully. No. Nolan studied him. 35. Ben said nothing. You don't know what you have, Nolan said. Ben almost laughed at that. Almost. Because men say the truest things when they're trying to manipulate you. If Nolan believed Ben didn't know, he wouldn't be standing in the cold adding $14,000 to the price before lunch. Ben opened the truck door. Nolan's voice tightened. 40. Ben paused. $40,000. For 1 second, the number pushed through him like heat. 40 would fix a lot. Not everything, but a lot. Rachel's student loan balance. The transmission. The roof. The credit card from June's last hospital winter that he never quite got ahead of. 40,000 would let him breathe. That was the dangerous part. Not greed. Relief. Relief makes people sell too early. Ben looked at Nolan and said, then you should have bid 40 inside, and got into the truck. The next 48 hours were miserable. He barely slept. He picked up the painting himself with a borrowed van from the museum's prep department, wrapped it in moving blankets, drove like he was carrying glass lungs. At home, he leaned it against the garage wall and just looked at it. Now that he owned it, doubt got louder. That's how doubt works. It waits until escape is impossible. What if the label was nothing? What if the repair scar was coincidence? What if Nolan had only been bluffing because dealers hate losing in public? By midnight, Ben was standing in the garage in socks and a flannel shirt, staring at $21,000 worth of anxiety. The next morning, he called the one person he thought might still remember. Harriet Sloan, former registrar at the museum, retired 6 years, sharp as a knife and twice as forgiving. She answered on the fourth ring. When he told her the artist's name, she went quiet. Then she said, where did you hear that? I need you to look at something. She came over that afternoon. Small woman, white hair pinned up, gloves in her purse, still carried herself like every object in the world might be mishandled if she didn't supervise. Ben took her into the garage. Didn't say much, just pulled the blanket back. Harriet stepped close, closer, then closer again. She said nothing for almost a minute. Finally, she whispered, good Lord. Not loud, not dramatic, just honest. She asked for a flashlight, then a magnifier, then a chair because her knees were giving out and she refused to kneel for anybody, including possible masterpieces. Ben waited. He could hear a dog barking 3 houses over. A lawnmower starting somewhere down the block. His own heartbeat. Harriet looked at the back first, then the lower right repair, then the edge pigment under the frame. And finally she stood up and took off her glasses. Ben, she said, I can't authenticate this in a garage, but if this is what I think it is. She didn't finish. She didn't have to. The museum arranged a private examination 2 days later. Off the books at first, then less off the books once the conservator saw the underdrawing under infrared. There had been a signature once, partially abraded, not forged, removed, probably during a crude cleaning decades ago. The old label on the back matched Beaumont Gallery in St. Louis. The canvas we've matched other known Clara Beaumont works from the late 1930s. The composition matched the missing catalog image from 1974 almost exactly, only better, richer, deeper because the old black and white photo had never captured the light on the water. By the end of the week, the guess had become a conclusion. The painting was real, not priceless, not some fantasy number people throw around online, but real, a documented, long-missing Clara Beaumont landscape with strong regional demand and a value estimated somewhere between $120,000 and $160,000 after conservation. When Harriet told him, Ben sat down, not because he was overcome, because his legs stopped cooperating. That was the part nobody in the auction room saw. The silence after the silence. The shaking after the victory. The strange grief that comes when life changes direction 1 inch and you realize how easily it could have gone the other way. He thought of June. Of course he did. How she would have laughed at the expression on Nolan's face. How she would have said, see, fear makes people predictable. He He thought of Rachel too. When he told her, she cried first, then got mad, then cried again. "You spent what?" she said. He let her finish. Then he told her the rest. There was a long pause on the phone. Finally, she said, very quietly, "Mom would have loved this." He said, "Yeah." That was all. Because some people are still in the room even after they're gone. News moved fast in the local antiques world. It always does. Within a week, people who hadn't looked twice at Ben in 10 years were suddenly very interested in his judgment. Dealers called. A private collector from Kansas City made an offer. Then another. The auction house called too, careful and cheerful, wanting to celebrate the remarkable rediscovery. Ben ignored that. He wasn't angry exactly. He just wasn't in the mood to help people sound wise after the fact. In the end, he didn't take the first offer, or the second. He had the painting lightly cleaned, stabilized, and placed through a broker Harriet trusted. 6 months later, it sold to a Midwest collector for $142,000. After fees and taxes, the number got smaller. Real life always does that. But it was still enough. More than enough. He paid off the hospital debt that had followed June's name like a shadow. He wiped out Rachel's student loans. Fixed the roof. Replaced the truck. Not with anything flashy. Just something that started when asked. And then he did one more thing that mattered more to him than the money. He made a donation to the museum. Modest by rich standards. Huge by his. Enough to fund 2 years of paid collections internships for students who couldn't afford to work for free. The program carried June Holloway's name. That part made Harriet cry. And maybe the best detail of all, Ben kept working for another year. Same museum, same night shift, same watch, same peppermints. People talked to him differently now. That was unavoidable. A few were warmer. A few were embarrassed. A few suddenly wanted to hear his opinion about every painting that came through the building. Ben never let it get theatrical. Never played genius. If someone asked how he knew, he'd shrug and say, "I paid attention." That bothered some people. They wanted a trick, a secret method, a magic phrase. But that was the truth. He paid attention. For years, while better-dressed people talked over him. While experts forgot he was standing there. While life trained him to notice what other people dismissed. That was the hidden advantage. Not money. Not status. Not luck exactly. Attention. Quiet attention. The kind that builds in people who spend years being underestimated. And maybe that's why the room went so silent at 19,000. Not just because the bid was high, but because everyone recognized, in one sharp, uncomfortable instant, that they had judged the wrong things. They had trusted polish, trusted reputation, trusted the man who looked like he belonged. And then the man they barely saw took control of the whole story with one number. That's what silenced them. Not the money, the reversal. The moment the room realized that certainty doesn't always arrive in a tailored suit. Sometimes it comes in work boots with paint on the heel. Sometimes it speaks softly. Sometimes it waits until the exact second everyone expects it to fold. And then it doesn't. So the next time a room tells you who matters before a word is spoken, watch carefully, because the quietest person there might already know where the real value is. And if you were standing in Ben's place, would you have taken Nolan's $40,000 in the parking lot? Or risked everything to find out what the painting really was?